1932, a biologist in California measured how fast a cow burns energy, and the number he got was wrong by every known theory. It took 65 years for anyone to explain why. In 2015, a team at the Santa Fe Institute ran survival statistics on 25,000 companies and discovered they die at the same rate as radioactive atoms, and the age of the company makes no difference. And in 2022, two researchers at Caltech published a proof in a peer-reviewed journal that every technological civilization in the universe is on a clock that no amount of energy or innovation can reset. A cow's metabolism, the death of Lehman Brothers, and the silence of the cosmos. These three things are governed by the same variable, a single number, published, confirmed, and ignored by every institution on the planet. And by the time you understand how they connect, the part about the cow will be the least disturbing thing you heard tonight. Get comfortable. This one runs long. If you are not subscribed, now is the time. And if you want more of this across physics, deep time, collapse, and everything adjacent, the Patreon is where that lives. Stay until the end of this one, because the final implication is the one that does not let go. There is a number that governs how fast everything around you is dying, not dying in the poetic sense, not entropy as a metaphor. A specific, measurable, dimensionless number that determines the rate at which your company will fail, the rate at which your city will hit crisis, the rate at which the civilization you live inside will approach a mathematical boundary it cannot cross. This number has been published. It has been peer-reviewed. It has been confirmed across datasets spanning organisms, corporations, cities, and potentially the structure of the universe itself. And as of today, not a single government, central bank, international body, or public institution on Earth tracks it. Nobody monitors it. Nobody reports it. It does not appear on any dashboard that any person in any position of power checks before making a decision about your future. The number is called beta, and the story of how it was discovered starts with a man who was told by his own family history that he was going to die. Geoffrey West was born on December 15, 1940, in Taunton, Somerset, a quiet rural town in the west of England. He came from a working-class family, and within that family there was a pattern that nobody talked about openly, but everyone understood. The men died young. His grandfather died at 57. His father died at 61. There was no dramatic medical diagnosis connecting them, no hereditary condition with a name you could look up in a textbook. Just a pattern, a line on an invisible graph that sloped downward with each generation. And Geoffrey grew up understanding, in the way that children absorb the unspoken mathematics of their households, that he would probably not live much past 60. He left Taunton at 13 when his family moved to London, and it was in London, walking the chalk cliffs south of the city as a boy of 10 or 11, looking out across the English Channel and watching ships get smaller and smaller on the horizon, that something clicked in his mind that would shape the rest of his life. A few years later, learning trigonometry in school, he encountered a problem. If you know the radius of the Earth and you are standing at the edge of the ocean, how far away is the horizon? There was a formula. You plugged in the radius and your height, and the answer came out in kilometers. West described that moment decades later with an intensity that had not dimmed at all. He said, "My God, this is powerful stuff." A formula that converts a number into a verifiable prediction about the physical world you can see with your own eyes. The rest of his career was an attempt to replicate that feeling. to find formulas that predict things about the world that you can check by looking out the window. He got into Cambridge, studied physics, graduated in 1961 with a Bachelor of Arts in Physics that placed him among the strongest theoretical minds of his generation. He went to Stanford for doctoral work on the pion, one of the subatomic particles that mediates the strong nuclear force, and earned his doctorate in 1966. He joined the Stanford faculty in 1970. Then he moved to Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, where he founded and led the High Energy Physics Group. For decades, this was his world. Quarks and gluons and quantum chromodynamics and the deep architecture of matter at scales so small that the distance from the nucleus of an atom to its electron shells is, relative to the nucleus, like the distance from a marble sitting on the 50-yard line of a football field to the bleachers. West spent his career probing structures smaller than that marble. And then, in 1993, Congress killed the Superconducting Super Collider. The SSC was supposed to be the most ambitious physics experiment ever built, a particle accelerator buried beneath the plains of Waxahachie, Texas, with a ring circumference of 87.1 kilometers, nearly 3 times the circumference of the Large Hadron Collider that CERN would eventually build in Geneva. It would have smashed protons together at 40 tera-electron volts, nearly 3 times the energy CERN's machine eventually achieved. The project had already consumed roughly $3 billion. 14 miles of tunnel had been excavated beneath the Texas clay. 17 shafts had been sunk. Physicists across the country had reorganized their entire careers around it. Graduate students had chosen dissertation topics based on what the SSC would be able to measure. Young researchers had moved their families to Texas, and then, in a single congressional vote, driven by budget politics and a post-Cold War loss of appetite for expensive science, it was dead. The money was gone. The tunnels filled with water. The surface buildings were eventually sold off to a chemical company that used them for warehousing. The shafts were capped with concrete, and an entire generation of American particle physicists, people who had devoted a decade or more of their working lives to the project, found themselves staring at a void where their career trajectories used to be. West was one of them. He was 53 years old. The SSC's cancellation did not just terminate a research program, it collided with the other thing he had been carrying his entire adult life: the quiet arithmetic of his family's mortality. He was 53. His father had died at 61. His grandfather at 57. If the pattern held, he had somewhere between 4 and 8 years left. The runway was short, and the destination at the end of it had just been demolished. What happened next is something West described in a 2012 interview with Discover magazine with a degree of raw personal honesty that is almost unheard of from scientists at his level. He said, and I want you to hear the exact words because they set up everything that follows. I was feeling disillusioned, and I was getting old. I come from a working-class family where the men die young. I had always assumed that I would probably not live much beyond about 60. And then he said the sentence that redirected his career, produced a body of work that has haunted me since I first encountered it, and ultimately led to the discovery of the single variable that this entire story is about. He said, somewhere, I thought, there should be a formula based on the underlying principles of how life works that would let you calculate the lifespan of a human being. A particle physicist, a man who had spent 3 decades studying quarks, asking a question that sounds almost childishly simple. Where does 100 years come from? Why do we die on the schedule we die on? Is there an equation? And because he was a physicist and not a biologist, He asked the question differently than a biologist would have. He did not ask, what causes aging? He asked, what determines the rate? Not the mechanism, the mathematics. What number, plugged into what equation, produces the observed lifespan of an organism as its output? He started looking into metabolism, not casually, not as a side project during idle afternoons. With the full analytical weight of a theoretical physicist who had spent decades deriving the fundamental forces of nature from first principles. And this is a detail that matters more than it might seem. Biologists had been studying metabolism for over a century. They had measured metabolic rates in thousands of species. They had compiled databases, published handbooks, built entire subdisciplines around the chemistry and physiology of energy conversion, but they had studied it as biologists. They described, they categorized, they measured. What they had not done, with very few exceptions, was derive. They had not asked the physicist's question, not what is the pattern, but why must the pattern exist? Not what does the data show, but what do the laws of physics require? West brought a different toolkit: differential equations, optimization theory, the mathematics of transport networks and fractal geometry. And he brought the conviction, drilled into him by 3 decades of particle physics, that behind every robust empirical pattern, there must be a derivation, an explanation rooted in physics that makes the pattern inevitable rather than accidental. And what he found was something that had been sitting in the biology literature for over 65 years, something that biologists knew about and debated endlessly, but had never been able to explain from first principles, and something that would turn out to be the first thread in a web that eventually connects your heartbeat to the death of corporations, to the mathematical fate of every civilization in the universe. He found Kleiber's law. In 1932, a Swiss agricultural biologist named Max Kleiber, working at the University of California at Davis, published a paper in a journal so obscure that most physicists have never heard of it. Kleiber was born in Zurich on January 4th, 1893. He trained as an agricultural chemist at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, earned his doctorate in 1924 with a thesis titled The Energy Concept in the Science of Nutrition, and arrived at UC Davis in 1929 to build respiration chambers and study energy metabolism in animals. He was not a theoretical physicist. He was not a mathematician. He was a man who built sealed boxes, put animals inside them, and measured how much oxygen they consumed per hour. But the question he was investigating turned out to be one of the most consequential in all of biology. He wanted to know how metabolic rate, the rate at which an organism converts food into energy, scales with body mass. The expectation at the time was straightforward. Animals lose heat through their skin. Surface area scales as body mass to the 2/3 power because area is a 2-dimensional quantity and mass is 3-dimensional. This was called Rubner's surface law, after the German physiologist Max Rubner, who proposed it in the 1880s. Bigger animals have proportionally less surface area per unit of mass, so they should burn proportionally less energy per kilogram. 2/3 power scaling, clean, intuitive, geometrically inevitable. Kleiber measured it. He built respiration chambers and sealed animals inside them, and tracked their oxygen consumption, which is a direct proxy for metabolic rate, because metabolic reactions consume oxygen at a rate proportional to energy production. He measured mice. He measured rats. He measured pigeons, hens, dogs, sheep, cattle. He plotted the numbers, and the exponent was not 2/3. It was 3/4. The basal metabolic rate of an animal scales as body mass raised to the power of 0.75, not 0.6, 7, not close enough to round off. Consistently, across every species measured, a mouse weighing 20 grams, and a cow weighing 500 kilos, and everything in between, all falling on the same straight line when you plotted log of metabolic rate against log of body mass. The slope of that line, measured across the mouse to elephant curve that biologists have been refining ever since, was 3/4. And for 65 years, from 1932 until 1997, nobody could explain why. Kleiber wrote about it more extensively in his 1961 book, The Fire of Life, An Introduction to Animal Energetics, which was translated into German, Polish, Spanish, and Japanese and became one of the standard references in comparative physiology. He died on January 5th, 1976, one day after his 83rd birthday, never having received a satisfactory explanation for the number he had discovered. The scientific community did what it always does when it finds a robust pattern it cannot explain. It named it Kleiber's Law, as if naming a mystery makes it less mysterious. And for 65 years, that is where it sat, a measured exponent with no theoretical foundation. 3/4, published, confirmed, replicated across birds, mammals, reptiles, fish, invertebrates, and in some studies, plants and single-celled organisms. A 2004 analysis of field metabolic rates across mammals confirmed the exponent at approximately 0.749, one of the most robust quantitative patterns in all of biology, and no derivation. I need to pause here because this is a pattern that repeats throughout this entire story, and it is worth naming explicitly. For 65 years, physics knew the answer to a question that biology could not solve. The explanation required the mathematics of flow through hierarchical branching networks, which belongs to physics and applied mathematics, not to physiology departments. Biology owned the question. Physics owned the tools. And the institutional structure of modern science, with its separate departments and separate journals, and separate tenure tracks and separate funding agencies, ensured that the question and the tools sat in adjacent buildings for 6.5 decades without ever meeting. This failure of institutional architecture is not incidental, it is load-bearing. The same failure explains why the scaling laws of cities and civilizations were ignored after they were published. The people who understand the mathematics do not make policy. The people who make policy do not read mathematics journals. And the space between them is where the most important implications go to die. Until Geoffrey West walked into the Santa Fe Institute. The Santa Fe Institute is a peculiar institution, founded in 1984, located in the high desert of northern New Mexico. It is an independent research institute dedicated to the study of complex systems. It has no departments, no tenure, no disciplinary boundaries. Scientists from completely different fields, physics, biology, economics, computer science, anthropology, archaeology, share offices and hallways, and critically, lunch tables. The institutional design is deliberate. George Cowan, the nuclear physicist who founded it, believed that the biggest unsolved problems in science were not within disciplines but between them, in the spaces where the methods of one field could illuminate the questions of another. The way to solve them was to put a physicist next to a biologist and see what happened. What happened with West was this. One day in the mid-1990s, he got a phone call from Mike Simmons, the vice president of the Santa Fe Institute. Simmons had a biologist he wanted West to meet. James Brown, a professor of ecology at the University of New Mexico, was one of the most accomplished ecologists in the country, a man who had spent years studying biological scaling laws, including Kleiber's law, and who was convinced that the explanation had to come from physics. Brown had been looking for a physicist willing to work on biological scaling. Simmons thought West might be the right match. West and Brown started meeting every Friday morning at 9 o'clock at the Santa Fe Institute. Brown brought his graduate student, Brian Enquist. The three of them sat in a room and talked about metabolic rates, network structures, the geometry of circulatory systems, the way tree branches deliver water from roots to leaves, the way lungs deliver oxygen from the atmosphere to the blood. Every Friday, for months, a particle physicist, an ecologist, and a graduate student, all looking at the same problem from different angles, using different vocabularies, gradually building a shared language that could express what none of their individual disciplines could say alone. What emerged from those Friday mornings was published in 1997 in the journal Science, volume 276, pages 122 through 126, a general model for the origin of allometric scaling laws in biology. West, Brown, and Enquist, and the paper proposed something that no biology department had been able to produce in 65 years, a derivation of the three-quarter power law from the basic physics of resource distribution networks. The argument goes like this. Your circulatory system is a fractal network. It starts with the aorta, a tube about 2.5 centimeters in diameter in an adult human, and branches into arteries, arterioles, and finally capillaries, each level of branching producing vessels that are smaller in diameter, more numerous, and collectively spanning a larger total cross-sectional area. The smallest capillaries are about 5 to 10 micrometers across, roughly the width of a single red blood cell. The total length of all the blood vessels in your body, if you could extract them and lay them end to end, is approximately 100,000 kilometers, enough to circle the Earth 2.5 times. This staggering length of vasculature exists for one purpose: to deliver oxygen and nutrients from a single pump, your heart, to every one of the approximately 37 trillion cells in your body. West, Brown, and Enquist asked a physicist's question about this network. If you were designing an optimal resource distribution network, one that fills three-dimensional space, reaches every cell, minimizes the energy cost of pumping, and maintains a constant flow rate at the terminal capillary level, what geometry would you get? They started from the physical constraints: conservation of fluid at every branching point, minimization of the total hydrodynamic resistance, the requirement that terminal units, capillaries, be approximately the same size regardless of the organism's total mass, because they need to interface with individual cells. And from those constraints, the mathematics produced a specific answer. The optimal network is a hierarchical, space-filling fractal, with branching ratios and vessel sizes that follow a precise set of scaling relationships. And the metabolic rate, which is determined by how fast blood can be pumped through this network, scales as body mass to the power of 3/4. Not approximately, exactly. 3/4 falls out of the mathematics the way the speed of light falls out of Maxwell's equations. It is not an empirical fit. It is a derived consequence of the physics of optimal network transport in three-dimensional space. The paper landed in the biology community like a foreign object. Here was a theoretical physicist, a man whose previous publications were about quarks, claiming to have solved a 65-year-old problem in biology using mathematics that most biologists had never encountered. The reaction was mixed. Some biologists were thrilled. Jim Brown, West's collaborator, had been advocating for exactly this kind of cross-disciplinary approach for years. Others were skeptical, sometimes aggressively so. The objections were partly technical, partly territorial. Who was this physicist to come into their field and claim to have answered their question? West addressed this dynamic directly in a later interview, with the kind of dry clarity that reveals decades of practice at navigating institutional resistance. He said, "There are always going to be people who say, 'What about the crayfish?' Well, what about it? Every fundamental law has exceptions, but you still need the law, or else all you have is observations that do not make sense." That sentence captures something essential about the scientific temperament required to do what West did. He was not interested in exceptions. He was interested in the rule. Exceptions tell you where the model's boundary conditions need refinement. The rule tells you what the universe is doing. And the rule, published in Science in 1997 and cited thousands of times since, is that biological systems obey quarter-power scaling because they distribute resources through space-filling fractal networks. The physics is sufficient. The biology is decoration. This was not a biology result. It was physics applied to biology, and it said something that biologists had not expected. Kleiber's law has nothing to do with the specific biochemistry of mammals, or the evolutionary history of vertebrates, or the particular chemistry of hemoglobin or mitochondria. It has to do with the mathematics of networks filling space. Any system that distributes resources through a hierarchical fractal network in 3 dimensions will produce quarter-power scaling. The biological details are irrelevant. The physics is sufficient. And here is where it reaches into your life. The quarter-power scaling does not just govern metabolic rate, it governs everything downstream from metabolic rate. Heart rate scales as mass to the -1/4 power. Bigger animals have slower hearts. Lifespan scales as mass to the +1/4 power. Bigger animals live longer. The diameter of the aorta, the rate of cell division, the pace of DNA replication, the time between successive divisions of stem cells in your gut lining, all of it follows quarter-power relationships. And when you combine the quarter-power scaling of heart rate with the quarter-power scaling of lifespan, something falls out of the algebra that should stop you cold. The total number of heartbeats in a mammal's lifetime is approximately constant across species. West laid this out explicitly in his 2017 book, Scale, published by Penguin Press. He wrote, "For almost all mammals, 1.5 billion heartbeats, more or less, is how much you have got over the course of its expected life, from the tiniest shrew weighing just a few grams to the largest whale. Every mammal's heart will beat roughly 1.5 billion times. The shrew, weighing about 2 grams, has a heart rate of over 1,000 beats per minute and lives about 2 years. A dog, say 30 kilograms, has a heart rate of around 100 beats per minute and lives about 12 years. An elephant, roughly 4,000 kilograms, has a heart rate of about 30 beats per minute and lives about 65 years. A blue whale exceeding 100,000 kilograms has a heart rate of around 5 beats per minute and lives about 80 years. Every single one of them gets approximately 1.5 billion heartbeats. The shrew burns through them in 2 years. The whale stretches them across 8 decades, but the total is the same. This is not a rough approximation. It is not poetic. It is the mathematical consequence of the quarter-power scaling laws applied to rate multiplied by duration. Metabolic rate per unit mass scales as mass to the -1/4. Lifespan scales as mass to the +1/4. Multiply rate by time and you get mass to the -1/4 times mass to the +1/4, which equals mass to the 0 power, which is 1, a constant independent of mass. 1.5 billion heartbeats, regardless of whether you are a shrew or a whale. I spent an unreasonable amount of time sitting with this before I could move on to what comes next, because the implication is not just that organisms have lifespans. Everyone knows that. The implication is that the lifespan is derivable from physics. From the geometry of fractal networks, your death is not a biological accident or the accumulated wear of living. It is the mathematical endpoint of a metabolic budget determined by the geometry of your circulatory system, the shrew and the whale, and you are all burning through the same budget at different rates. And the rate is set by physics, not by diet or exercise, or lifestyle, or willpower. And here is a fact that will follow you around after you hear it. Every mammal gets roughly 1.5 billion heartbeats. Humans are slight outliers. We live about twice as long as our body mass would predict, probably because of cooked food, social cooperation, and medicine. A 70-kilogram mammal, following the standard curve, would live about 25 to 30 years. We get 75 to 80. Civilization bought us the extra decades, but the architecture is the same. Your heart beats about 100,000 times a day, about 36 million times a year. If you are 35, your heart has beaten approximately 1.26 billion times. If you are 50, it has beaten about 1.8 billion. The numbers are not metaphorical. They are the output of the scaling equations published in Science in 1997. And Geoffrey West, the man who went looking for the formula that would predict his own death, found it. The formula was real and specific and published and cited thousands of times. It told him, with the quiet indifference of mathematics, that every organism is allocated a fixed metabolic budget and the rate of expenditure is the single variable governing lifespan. He found the formula, and then he did something that nobody expected, something that took the most disturbing idea in biology and made it immeasurably worse. He asked whether the same mathematics applied to things that are not alive. I need you to hold what you have learned so far, because it becomes the foundation for everything that follows. West did not stop at organisms. He and his collaborators asked whether the scaling laws that emerge from the physics of resource distribution networks also govern human systems, cities, economies, corporations, civilizations, whether there is a single exponent, a single number, that determines the rate at which human institutions grow, innovate, and die. You need to appreciate the audacity of this question. A man trained in quark physics, who had pivoted to explaining why cows consume oxygen at the rate they do, was now asking whether New York City and General Electric and the Roman Empire obey the same mathematical laws as a blue whale. The conventional wisdom in every relevant discipline would say no. Economists would say economies are driven by human decisions, not physical law. Urban planners would say cities are products of history and geography, not scaling exponents. Business professors would say corporate survival depends on strategy and leadership, not mathematical destiny. And all of them would have reasonable arguments. But West had something they did not. He had the data. What he and his collaborators found was published in 2007 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Volume 104, pages 7,301 through 7,306. The paper was authored by Luis Betancourt, Jose Lobo, Dirk Helbing, Christian Kunert, and Geoffrey West. It was titled Growth, Innovation, Scaling, and the Pace of Life in Cities. Time magazine had already named West one of its 100 most influential people in the world in 2006. The Harvard Business Review called his work one of the breakthrough ideas of 2007. And then, for the institutions that actually make decisions about the future, the work was praised, acknowledged, and quietly set aside. It has never influenced a single piece of legislation or regulatory policy in any country on Earth. The reason for this will become clear. They collected data on cities across the United States, China, Germany, and several European nations. They measured everything quantifiable: total wages, GDP, number of patents filed, number of inventors, total electrical consumption, road surface area, number of gas stations, length of electrical cables, gasoline sales, total housing, serious crimes, AIDS cases, walking speed of pedestrians on city streets, dozens of variables across hundreds of cities, across multiple nations and economic systems and cultures. And every single variable fell on a straight line when plotted against population on a log-log graph. The slope of that line is the scaling exponent, and the exponent separated into two distinct groups with a precision that is stunning for a social science result. Infrastructure variables, the physical stuff, roads, electrical cables, gas stations, housing, the total length of wires, scale sublinearly. The exponent is less than 1, typically clustering around 0.85. Double a city's population, and you do not need to double its road network. You need about 85% more. Cities become more efficient as they grow. More people share the same roads, the same power grid, the same water mains. This is the economy of scale that urban planners have always known about intuitively, but had never been able to quantify as a universal law. But the socio-economic variables, wages, GDP, patents, crime, disease, innovation, creative employment, scale superlinearly, the exponent is greater than 1. And the specific values, from Betancourt's Table 1, are remarkably consistent across countries, decades, and economic systems. Wages in the United States scale with an exponent of 1.12, with a 95% confidence interval of 1.09 to 1.13. GDP in China scales at 1.15. GDP in Germany at 1.13. New patents at 1.27. Number of inventors at 1.25. Super creative employment at 1.15. Serious crimes at 1.16. Total electrical consumption at 1.07. Across countries, across cultures, across decades, the number clusters around 1.15. Beta equals approximately 1.15. And in West's own words, delivered with the understated clarity of someone who knew what the number meant, doubling a city's population produces roughly a 15% increase in per capita, wages, patents, and GDP. It also produces roughly a 15% increase in per capita crime. The same scaling exponent governs both. Innovation and pathology are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon measured in different units. The superlinear scaling that produces more creativity per person also produces more crime per person, more disease per person, more stress per person. The good and the bad scale together, driven by the same network dynamics, governed by the same exponent. This is the number. This is the variable. And there is a detail in the Betancourt data that I think captures the visceral reality of superlinear scaling better than any equation. They measured the average walking speed of pedestrians on city streets, not driving speed. Walking speed, the pace at which human beings move their legs through public space. And it scales superlinearly with city population. People in bigger cities literally walk faster. Not because they are in better shape or more athletic, because the social metabolism of the city, the pace at which interactions occur and information is exchanged and transactions are completed, accelerates as the city grows. The city does not just contain more activity. It is faster activity, per person, per interaction, per minute. The entire tempo of human existence shifts upward as a function of the number of people around you. And here is the part that nobody puts in the tourism brochures. The same exponent that makes larger cities more innovative, wealthier per capita, and faster moving also makes them more dangerous, more diseased, and more stressful per capita. Serious crimes scale at 1.16. AIDS cases scale superlinearly. The density of social interaction that produces more patterns per person also produces more violence per person. These are not separate phenomena driven by separate causes. They are the same phenomenon. The superlinear scaling of human interaction amplifies everything, the creative and the destructive alike. And the amplification factor is beta. You cannot have the innovation without the pathology. They are mathematically coupled. They share an exponent. This is something that urban policy has never grappled with, because urban policy does not think in terms of scaling exponents. City planners talk about reducing crime and fostering innovation as if these are independent goals that can be pursued separately. The mathematics says they cannot. They are produced by the same network dynamics, governed by the same parameter. You can suppress one only by suppressing both. The exponent does not distinguish between a patent filing and an assault. Now, to understand why beta should trouble you in ways that go far beyond urban planning, you need to understand what happens mathematically when a scaling exponent exceeds 1. In biology, the exponent for metabolic scaling is 3/4, less than 1, sublinear. This means organisms reach a stable adult size. Growth slows as the organism gets larger because maintenance costs rise faster than the rate at which resources can be produced and distributed. You grow, reach maturity, maintain, age, die. Bounded, predictable. The 3/4 exponent produces equilibrium. When beta equals exactly 1, the growth equation produces exponential growth. Population doubles, output doubles. This is the regime that most economic models assume. GDP grows at 3% per year, forever. Most financial models, most retirement calculators, most government budget projections have this assumption embedded in their foundations. But when beta is greater than 1, even by a small amount, even by 0.15, the character of the mathematics changes qualitatively. Betancourt and West wrote down a differential equation for the growth of a city. The rate of population change equals the rate of resource production, which scales as n to the power beta, minus the rate of resource consumption for maintenance, which scales linearly as n. When beta exceeds 1, the production term grows faster than the maintenance term. Growth accelerates, and the solution to this equation is not an exponential. It is a function that diverges to infinity at a specific, calculable, finite future time. This is called a finite time singularity. It means there exists a date, derivable from the equation, using the measured value of beta and the current population, at which the growth rate would theoretically become infinite. This is not metaphor. It is a mathematical consequence of a measured exponent. The equations produce this date the same way orbital mechanics produces the date of the next solar eclipse. It is a prediction, not a suggestion. They tested it. They plotted the relative population growth rate of New York City from 1780 to 2004 using United States Census data. The fit to the superlinear growth equation was striking. Beta for New York came out to 1.09, and the predicted singularity times the dates at which the model said the city would face unsustainable crisis without a paradigm-shifting innovation, aligned with actual historical transitions visible in the census record. The shift from agrarian to mercantile, from mercantile to industrial, from industrial to the information economy. Each crisis arrived, was resolved, by innovation, and the clock reset. But here is the result that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read their paper. The time between required innovations shrinks. Each reset buys less time than the last. The mathematical expression is in their equation 4. The inter-innovation cycle time is proportional to 1 over the initial population raised to the power of beta minus 1. As the population grows, the next required paradigm shift must arrive sooner. And the shrinking is not linear. It accelerates, because the same superlinear scaling that created the original crisis accelerates the approach of the next one. Their paper states the conclusion in the deadpan tone that physicists use when delivering the worst possible news. Growth becomes faster than exponential, eventually leading to an infinite population in a finite amount of time. The characteristic time to singularity for a large city is, in their estimation, typically a few decades. To sustain growth, major innovations must arise at an accelerated rate. And I need to show you what that acceleration looks like when you plot it against the actual historical record, because the pattern is visible to the naked eye, and nobody frames it this way. Agriculture. Roughly 10,000 years ago, the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer bands to settled farming communities in the Fertile Crescent, the Yangtze River Valley, and independently in at least 6 other locations worldwide. This was not a lifestyle choice. It was a civilizational phase transition. It restructured every dimension of human existence: social hierarchy, property, warfare, religion, population density, diet, disease exposure, the concept of ownership itself. All of it changed, and the new paradigm brought roughly 5,000 years of relative stability before the system's accumulated complexity demanded another innovation. Writing. Roughly 5,000 years ago, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphics in Egypt, proto-writing in the Indus Valley. For the first time, information could be stored outside of individual human memory. Laws could be codified, debts could be recorded, stories could outlive their tellers. The dataome was born, and this brought roughly 4,000 years before the next reset. Notice the interval, already shortened. 5,000 years of stability after agriculture, 4,000 after writing, metallurgy, and organized empire. The Bronze Age, then the Iron Age. The development of technologies for smelting, casting, and working metals, combined with the political structures required to organize mining, trade, armies, and taxation at scale. Roughly 3,000 years ago, the interval from writing to organized metallurgical empire was shorter still. The printing press, 1450, Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany. The mechanization of information reproduction. Before Gutenberg, every book was a hand-copied manuscript. The production of a single Bible took a scribe roughly 3 years. After Gutenberg, a book could be produced in days. Information was no longer scarce. The Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the rise of vernacular literacy, all of them were downstream consequences of one machine. The interval from the previous major reset was roughly 2,000 years. The steam engine. 1712. Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine, initially used to pump water out of coal mines, refined into a practical power source by James Watt beginning in 1769. For the first time, physical labor could be mechanized. The entire industrial revolution, factories, railroads, steamships, urbanization, all of it was a downstream consequence of converting heat into mechanical work. The interval from the printing press to steam was roughly 260 years, dramatically shorter. Electrification. 1882. Thomas Edison opened the Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan, the first commercial central power plant, delivering direct current electricity to 85 customers in a 1 square mile area. Within 40 years, electrification had restructured cities, created the modern factory, enabled refrigeration, air conditioning, radio, and the entertainment industry. The interval from steam to electrification was roughly 130 years, half the previous gap. The transistor, 1947. William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey. A semiconductor device that replaced the vacuum tube, making electronic circuits smaller, cheaper, faster, and more reliable by orders of magnitude. The entire digital age, from mainframe computers to the internet to the phone in your pocket, descends from this single invention. 65 years after electrification. Half again. The personal computer, roughly 1975 to 1981, depending on whether you date it from the MIT's, Altair 8800, or the IBM PC. Computing power moved from institutional rooms to individual desks. 30 years after the transistor. The World Wide Web. 1991. Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research in Geneva, originally built it as a way for physicists to share documents. Within a decade, it had restructured commerce, communication, media, politics, and social interaction worldwide. 15 years after the personal computer, the smartphone. 2007, Apple's iPhone placed a networked computer with a touchscreen, camera, GPS, and cellular connection in the pocket of every person in the developed world, and increasingly in the developing world. 16 years after the web, but the behavioral transformation happened within 5. Generative artificial intelligence. 2022 to 2023. ChatGPT, GPT-4, Claude, Gemini, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. Systems capable of generating human-quality text, code, images, and analysis from natural language instructions. The transition from curiosity to civilizational disruption happened in roughly 18 months. 5 years after smartphones became ubiquitous. Write the intervals as a sequence: 5,000, 4,000, 2,000, 260, 130, 65, 30, 15, 10, 5. That is not an arithmetic sequence. It is not a linear decline. It is a geometric series where each term is roughly 40 to 60% of the one before it, and a geometric series with a common ratio less than 1 has a finite sum, which means that even if you could produce an infinite number of future innovations, each arriving faster than the last, the total time they buy is finite. The series converges. There is a wall. I want to stop here and make sure you feel what I felt when I first plotted these numbers, because the abstraction can mask what is actually happening to you. Your great-grandparents were born into a world that ran on steam and horses and telegraph wires. Between their birth and their death, the major paradigm shift they lived through was electrification. One fundamental restructuring of civilization in an entire lifetime. That was the pace. 1 per lifetime. Your grandparents might have lived through 2. Electrification and the transistor. Maybe the automobile and the telephone as well, depending on how you count. 2 or 3 fundamental shifts in the space of 80 years. Your parents lived through the transistor, the personal computer, the internet, and the smartphone. 4 paradigm shifts in one lifetime, each one reshaping the structure of work, communication, entertainment, relationships, and institutional life. You are living through the smartphone, generative AI, and whatever comes after generative AI, which based on the series should arrive within the next 3 to 5 years. You are already experiencing 3 or more paradigm shifts per lifetime, each one compressing into a shorter window, each one arriving before the previous one has been fully absorbed. Your children, if the series holds, will experience paradigm shifts separated by months, not years. The concept of adapting to a new technology will become meaningless because the next disruption will arrive before the adaptation to the previous one is complete. The concept of a career built on a stable set of skills will become as archaic as a career built on knowing how to shoe horses. Not because the individual skills are useless, but because the half-life of relevant skills will compress below the time required to acquire them. This is not futurism. This is the mathematical consequence of a measured exponent applied to an empirically confirmed series. The numbers do not care whether you find them plausible. They are the output of an equation published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the equation has been tested against 3 centuries of United States Census data, and it fits. This is the mathematical heart of everything I am about to tell you, and it connects West's scaling laws to the most disturbing paper I found in this entire body of research. But first I need to take you somewhere that demonstrates the pattern is not confined to civilizational timescales. It operates within a single human lifetime. It operates on structures that most people think of as permanent, invulnerable, too big to fail. And the data that proves this was sitting in a database at Standard & Poor's for 60 years before anyone thought to analyze it with the right mathematics. In 2015, the Journal of the Royal Society Interface published a paper by Madeleine Dape, Marcus Hamilton, Geoffrey West, and Louise Betancourt. The title was quiet, almost clinical, The Mortality of Companies. The result was anything but. Dape was an undergraduate fellow at the Santa Fe Institute when West and his colleagues handed her a dataset and a question. The dataset was Standard & Poor's Composite, a comprehensive database of every publicly traded North American company from 1950 to 2009. More than 25,000 companies, 6 decades of births, mergers, acquisitions, bankruptcies, and disappearances. The question was whether corporate death follows a statistical pattern, not anecdotally, not based on case studies of famous collapses, statistically, across all companies, across all sectors, across the entire modern economic era. Dape used a methodology called survival analysis, the same statistical framework used in medical research to study how long cancer patients survive after diagnosis. You track a cohort from the moment they enter the study, which for companies means the date they went public, and you measure how long each one lasts before it exits, through bankruptcy, merger, acquisition, or delisting. What they expected, based on decades of economic theory, was that older companies would be more resilient than younger ones. That experience, institutional knowledge, brand equity, and accumulated capital would provide a cumulative survival advantage. That a firm which had survived 50 years would have a significantly lower probability of dying in the next year than a firm which had been public for 5. This is what business schools teach. It is implicit in how credit agencies rate corporate debt. It is the foundation of the concept of a blue chip stock. It is baked into the entire architecture of long-term investing. Old companies are stable companies. Size and age confer durability. The data demolished this completely. The mortality rate of publicly traded companies is approximately constant over time. It does not depend on the company's age. A company that has been publicly traded for 5 years has roughly the same probability of dying in the next year as a company that has been publicly traded for 50 years. The hazard rate is flat. The risk does not decrease with experience. Survival does not improve with time. And the resulting half-life, the time it takes for half of any cohort of companies to disappear, is approximately 10.5 years. Marcus Hamilton, one of the co-authors, described the result with the bluntness of someone who knew it would be unpopular. He told Science Daily, "It does not matter if you are selling bananas, airplanes, or whatever. The mortality rate is the same." I want to make sure the weight of this lands before I move on, because this result governs your life in ways you have probably never considered. If you took 100 companies listed on a stock exchange today, by 2036, approximately 50 of them will be gone. By 2046, roughly 75. By 2056, approximately 87. And it does not matter which 100 you pick. Take the 100 largest by market capitalization. Take the 100 oldest. Take the 100 most profitable. Take the 100 with the most decorated management teams, the highest employee satisfaction ratings, the most innovative product pipelines. The hazard rate does not discriminate. The half-life is a decade, regardless. The historical record confirms this at a scale that makes it impossible to dismiss as an anomaly. The original Fortune 500 list was published in 1955. Those 500 companies represented the institutional bedrock of the largest economy on Earth. They were not speculative startups. They were General Motors, Standard Oil, US Steel, General Electric, Chrysler, the permanent infrastructure of American capitalism. And today, over 88% of them are gone from the list. Most are gone entirely. Merged, acquired, bankrupted, dissolved, or shrunk below the threshold. Companies that felt as permanent as the ground beneath your feet. American Motors, Studebaker, Bethlehem Steel, Pan American World Airways, Woolworths, Digital Equipment Corporation, Compaq, Eastman Kodak, which dominated the photography industry for over a century and filed for bankruptcy in 2012, unable to survive the transition to digital imaging, even though Kodak itself had invented the first digital camera in 1975. The company that invented its own future could not survive it. Or take 2008. Bear Stearns, founded in 1923, 85 years of continuous operation, collapsed in a matter of days in March of 2008 and was acquired by JP Morgan Chase for $2 per share, down from a 52-week high of 133. Lehman Brothers, founded in 1850, 158 years old, the fourth largest investment bank in the United States, filed for bankruptcy on September 15, 2008, the largest bankruptcy in American history at the time. $639 billion in assets. Gone. Washington Mutual, Wachovia, Merrill Lynch, Countrywide Financial, AIG, which required $182 billion in government rescue to prevent cascading global financial collapse. These were not marginal firms. These were among the most powerful, most institutionally entrenched, most closely monitored financial corporations in human history. And the constant hazard rate treated them exactly the same as a 5-year-old tech startup. The mathematical form of this mortality is something physicists recognize on sight. It is radioactive decay. Uranium-238 has a half-life of approximately 4.5 billion years. Carbon-14 has a half-life of about 5,730 years. And a publicly traded North American company has a half-life of about 10.5 years. The mathematical structure is identical. An exponential decay function, a constant hazard rate, a predictable half-life. The same equations. And the reason this should disturb you is not the half-life itself. Companies die. Everyone knows this. What should disturb you is the implication of the constant hazard rate. In radioactive decay, the constant hazard rate is a consequence of quantum mechanics. Each unstable nucleus has a fixed probability of decaying in any given time interval, completely independent of how long it has already existed. The nucleus has no memory. It cannot learn. It cannot adapt. It simply has a probability of ceasing to exist. And that probability never changes with age. The DAPE paper is saying that corporations work the same way. Not metaphorically, mathematically. A company that has survived for 80 years has not accumulated any statistical resistance to death that a 5-year-old company lacks. Whatever force kills companies, it operates with the same memoryless, age-independent indifference as nuclear decay, the same mathematical signature, the same flat hazard curve, the same exponential survival function. I want to sit with the personal implications of this for a moment. The company you work for has a half-life of approximately a decade. The bank that holds your mortgage, the insurance company that backs your health coverage, the brokerage managing your retirement savings, the pharmaceutical company that manufactures your medication. Every one of these is a statistical object with a measured half-life of 10.5 years. They feel permanent. They have buildings, logos, histories, mission statements, annual reports, reputations. But the mathematics says they are not permanent. They are statistically decaying, constantly, at a rate that does not improve with age. There is one contrast in the data that makes this even more unsettling. The Santa Fe Institute hosted a workshop exploring why different types of organizations have such different lifespans. The workshop noted that the average age of the top 5 publicly traded companies in the United States, ranked by market capitalization, is less than 30 years. The average age of the top 5 private nonprofit universities, ranked by endowment size, is over 250 years. Harvard was founded in 1636. Yale in 1701, Princeton in 1746, Columbia in 1754. These institutions have survived revolutions, civil wars, world wars, depressions, pandemics, and the complete transformation of the economy from agrarian to industrial to informational. Companies that were their contemporaries are long dead. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, the most valuable corporation in the history of the world when adjusted for inflation, was dissolved in 1800. The Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, still technically exists but is unrecognizable from its original form. Why do universities live for centuries while companies die in decades? The answer, within the scaling framework, is organizational purpose. Companies are structured to maximize shareholder value, which requires growth. Growth is superlinear. Superlinear systems face finite time singularities. Universities are structured to preserve and transmit knowledge, which does not require growth. Their organizational metabolism is closer to sublinear. They are more like organisms than like cities. They grow to a certain size, reach equilibrium, and maintain. They have a different exponent, and the exponent is the variable that determines the lifespan. This is not a metaphor. It is a testable prediction of the scaling framework. Organizations whose core purpose requires superlinear growth will have short, predictable lifespans. Organizations whose core purpose permits sublinear equilibrium will have long lifespans. The variable that determines which category your institution falls into is the effective scaling exponent of its central activity. And nobody thinks about organizational design this way. Nobody asks, when founding a company, or restructuring an agency, or designing a policy, what is the effective beta of this institution? The question is not even in the vocabulary. Now, the pattern is fractal. Organisms die on a schedule governed by the 3/4 power law, 1.5 billion heartbeats. Companies die on a schedule governed by a constant hazard rate, half-life of a decade. Universities survive for centuries because their effective scaling exponent is different. Cities survive only by innovating on an ever faster schedule governed by the superlinear exponent, beta. And the question that West's work has been building toward, the question that has been accumulating weight since the first paragraph of this story, is now unavoidable. If organisms die on schedule, and companies die on schedule, and cities can only survive by innovating at an accelerating rate, then what about the thing that contains all of them? What about the civilization? Does it have a scaling exponent? Does it have a half-life? Does it have a finite time singularity that no amount of innovation can postpone? In 2022, two researchers published a paper that takes the mathematics of West and Betancourt and follows it to a conclusion so disturbing that it reframes every assumption you hold about the future. The paper appeared in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface, Volume 19, number 190. The authors were Michael Wong of the Carnegie Institution for Science and Stuart Bartlett of the Division of Geological and Planetary Sciences at the California Institute of Technology. The title is Asymptotic Burnout and Homeostatic Awakening, a Possible Solution to the Fermi Paradox. The Fermi Paradox is the observation first articulated by physicist Enrico Fermi during a lunch conversation at Los Alamos in 1950, that the universe is very large and very old and contains billions of potentially habitable planets, and yet shows zero evidence that any other technological civilization has ever existed anywhere. Not a single radio signal, not a megastructure visible through any telescope, not a probe, not an artifact, not a footprint. The universe is silent. Where is everybody? Dozens of proposed solutions have been offered over the decades. Maybe the origin of life is extraordinarily rare. Maybe civilizations are too far apart in space and time to detect each other. Maybe advanced civilizations deliberately hide. Maybe they invariably destroy themselves with nuclear weapons or ecological collapse. These proposals are almost without exception unfalsifiable narrative speculation. Stories that fit the data because they were designed to fit the data. Wong and Bartlett's solution is fundamentally different. It is mathematical. It does not speculate about alien psychology or sociology. It derives the answer from the scaling equations. And the derivation is so clean, so direct, so free of the hand-waving that characterizes most Fermi paradox proposals, that reading it feels less like encountering a hypothesis and more like watching a proof close. Their argument builds on Betancourt and West in 3 steps. First, the superlinear scaling observed in cities is not a quirk of human culture. It is a mathematical consequence of any system in which agents interact socially, and those interactions generate innovation. Whenever agents form networks, and those networks produce new ideas, the output scales superlinearly with the number of agents. Beta is greater than 1. This is not a human-specific result. It is not about capitalism or democracy or any particular political system. It is a property of networks. Period. Any technological civilization, anywhere in the universe, built by any kind of organism, carbon-based, or silicon-based, or something we have never imagined. That develops networked social interaction and begins to accumulate cultural and technical information outside of individual minds. What Wang and Bartlett call a data ohm will exhibit superlinear scaling, and superlinear scaling produces finite time singularities. I want to dwell on this concept of the data ohm for a moment, because it is the key to understanding why Wang and Bartlett believe the mathematics applies universally and not just to humans. A data ohm is the sum total of information that a civilization stores externally. For us, it started with cave paintings, then oral traditions, then writing, then libraries, then the printing press, then the internet, then the cloud. The data ohm is the accumulated knowledge, culture, technology, and institutional memory that allows each generation to start from where the previous one left off, rather than from scratch. It is what makes civilization cumulative rather than cyclical. And here is the critical insight. The data ohm is what drives superlinear scaling. It is not population growth itself that produces the finite time singularity. It is the fact that each additional person in a networked civilization can access and contribute to the shared information commons, and the interactions between people and the data ohm produce innovations at a superlinear rate. The data ohm is the amplifier. It takes linear population growth and converts it into superlinear innovation growth. And any civilization that develops a data ohm, by definition, enters the superlinear regime. There is no version of technological civilization that avoids this. The data ohm is what makes you technological, and the data ohm is what kills you. Second, the singularities require innovation resets. To avoid, each reset buys time. But the mathematics shows that each reset buys less time than the one before, because the inter-innovation cycle time decreases as the system grows. The cycle times form a geometric series, and Wang and Bartlett show formally that when the scaling exponent exceeds a critical threshold, the sum of all future cycle times converges to a finite value. The precise threshold depends on model assumptions, but for the empirically measured range of beta, the series converges. And third, a convergent geometric series has a finite sum, which means the total amount of time available for all future innovations, even if you could somehow produce an infinite number of them, each arriving faster than the last, is finite. There is a mathematical wall. The time between required innovations shrinks to zero in a finite amount of time. And when it reaches zero, the next required innovation would need to arrive instantaneously, which no physical process can achieve. Innovation requires time. It requires research, experimentation, testing, deployment, adoption, institutional restructuring. These are physical processes that occur in physical time. They cannot be compressed to zero duration. And yet the mathematics demands exactly that. The paper states this with the quiet precision of a proof. The time scale between innovations vanishes in a finite amount of time, and there will be a hard cutoff to the longevity of such a civilization. And then, in a sentence that I believe should be printed on billboards and read aloud in legislative chambers and tattooed on the foreheads of central bankers, they write, "New energy resources cannot sustain a superlinear system indefinitely due to the finite timescale associated with the singularity." I need you to absorb what that sentence is claiming. It is not saying we might run out of energy. It is not saying fossil fuels are limited. It is not saying that any particular resource is scarce. It is saying that even with unlimited energy, unlimited fusion power, unlimited solar, unlimited anything, the mathematical structure of superlinear growth contains its own termination date. A Dyson sphere harvesting the entire energy output of the sun would not change the conclusion. Because the problem is not the amount of energy available. The problem is the rate at which the system demands innovation to avoid the next singularity. And that rate is governed by beta. And beta is greater than 1. And when beta is greater than 1, the convergence series produces a finite total lifespan for the civilization, regardless of how many resources you give it. I personally think this is the most underrated result in the entire body of literature I reviewed for this project, and I still do not fully know how to sit with it, because it is not a warning about the future. It is a mathematical description of a trajectory we are already on. The innovation cadence is already compressing. The cycle times are already shrinking. The series is already converging. The question is not whether there is a war. The question is how far away it is, and the variable that determines the distance is beta, and nobody is measuring it at the civilizational scale. This is a mathematical proof that technological optimism has a hard limit, not a practical limit, a mathematical one, a finite time singularity beyond which the concept of innovating your way out becomes logically incoherent. Wang and Bartlett used this to answer Fermi. Where is everybody? They are gone. Not because they were foolish or unlucky, because the scaling exponent that drives the growth of any networked technological civilization produces a convergent series that terminates in a finite time. Every civilization that develops a data ohm is on a clock. The clock is set by beta, and beta, as far as the mathematics can determine, is not negotiable. The only escape route the paper identifies is what they call homeostatic awakening. A civilization recognizes the mathematics of its own trajectory and deliberately, voluntarily, abandons growth entirely. Not slower growth, not green growth, not sustainable growth, not the polite fiction of degrowth that gets discussed at academic conferences and then ignored by every practical policy institution. Zero growth. A conscious, deliberate restructuring of every economic, political, social, and technological institution to operate within a bounded, sublinear framework, where the scaling exponent is reduced to 1 or below. Think about what that would actually mean. It would mean abandoning the concept of GDP growth as a measure of national success. It would mean restructuring every corporation on Earth away from the legal obligation to maximize shareholder returns. It would mean redesigning retirement systems that currently depend on market growth to meet their obligations. It would mean renegotiating every sovereign debt arrangement, because sovereign debt is serviceable only if GDP grows faster than interest. It would mean fundamentally restructuring the incentive system that governs every career path in every knowledge economy job. Every promotion, every raise, every venture capital investment, every stock option, every business plan, every government budget projection assumes growth. Homeostatic awakening would require dismantling all of it simultaneously. And here is the catch. The same network dynamics that produce superlinear scaling also produce the political and social structures that make this restructuring impossible. Superlinear scaling creates winner-take-all dynamics. It concentrates wealth in large cities and large institutions. It creates political constituencies whose livelihoods depend on continued growth. It creates financial instruments whose value collapses if growth stops. It creates a media ecosystem that frames any reduction in GDP as a crisis. The system generates its own political antibodies against the only intervention that could save it. Wang and Bartlett acknowledge this, obliquely, in the language of a peer-reviewed paper. They note that homeostatic awakening requires a civilization to develop the capability to understand its own trajectory and then to act on that understanding in time. The window between understanding and burnout is finite. And for a civilization that has been growing superlinearly for millennia, voluntarily stopping is not like a driver applying brakes. It is like asking every cell in an organism to simultaneously agree to reduce its metabolic rate. The coordination problem is, in any practical sense, unsolvable. Burn or retreat. Those are the two doors the mathematics permits, and the variable that determines how fast you reach the first door is the same variable that governs how fast cities innovate and companies decay and organisms burn through heartbeats. Beta. I need to address the criticisms honestly because I refuse to pretend they do not exist. Cosma Shalizi, a statistician at Carnegie Mellon, an external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute itself, published a 2011 analysis titled Scaling and Hierarchy in Urban Economies. His argument is that the striking appearance of power law scaling in city data is partly an artifact of methodology. When you measure total citywide quantities, bigger cities mechanically have bigger totals, and this can inflate the apparent scaling exponent. When you switch to per capita rates, Shalizi argues the superlinear signal weakens substantially. His paper states that the data cannot distinguish between power laws and other functional forms, including logarithmic growth. Chris Jackson and Christian Criado Perez at the University of New South Wales published a direct response to Wong and Bartlett in 2024, questioning whether data measured at the city level can legitimately be extrapolated to the civilizational level. Cities are open systems. People move in and out. Resources flow across borders. A civilization does not have the same boundary conditions as a city. And the West, Brown, Enquist derivation of the three-quarter power law has its own critics. Van Savage, Eric Deeds, and Walter Fontana showed in 2008 that the WBE network model only produces the exact three-quarter exponent in the mathematical limit of infinitely large organisms. For finite organisms, deviations are expected. A 2022 analysis across 642 metabolic relationships in 218 species found that over 50% deviated significantly from 0.75. These are real criticisms. I take them seriously, and I am not going to wave them away to protect a narrative. But here is what the critics do not dispute. Nobody denies that the innovation cadence of human civilization is measurably compressing. Nobody denies that the intervals between paradigm shifts form an accelerating series. Nobody has a model in which the required pace of innovation decelerates over time. The debate is about whether the specific mathematical framework of Betancourt and West perfectly captures the mechanism, and whether the specific value of beta is as stable and universal as claimed. The pattern, the accelerating treadmill, the compressing innovation windows, the observation that each technological revolution buys less stability than the one before is not contested. It is visible in the data to anyone who plots the dates. And while the mathematicians argue about the precise value of the exponent, the treadmill keeps accelerating. The time between AI breakthroughs is now measured in months. The regulatory and educational institutions trying to respond to it are still operating on timescales of years and decades. The compression is not theoretical. It is happening, right now, in real time, to you. And I want to say something here that I have been holding back, because I was not sure it belonged in a piece that is otherwise grounded in peer-reviewed data. But I think it needs to be said, because there is a gap between what the mathematics describes and what people actually feel, and that gap is itself evidence of the phenomenon. You have probably noticed, over the last 5 to 10 years, that the world feels like it is moving faster, not in a vague poetic sense, in a specific, measurable sense. The pace of change in your profession, in the tools you use, in the platforms you communicate on, in the skills the market demands, in the political landscape, in the cultural conversation, all of it is accelerating. And you have probably been told that this is a subjective impression, that every generation feels like the pace of change is increasing, that your grandparents felt the same way about the automobile and the telephone, that this is just the perennial human experience of aging in a changing world. That is wrong. The mathematics says the pace of change is objectively increasing, not as a perception, as a measured quantity. The intervals between paradigm shifts are shrinking. The data confirms it. The series is geometric. The compression is real. What you are feeling is not nostalgia or anxiety or information overload. It is the sensory experience of living inside a convergent series. You are feeling beta. And the reason nobody has told you this, the reason the acceleration is framed as a psychological phenomenon rather than a mathematical one, is that framing it as mathematics requires acknowledging where the mathematics leads. And where it leads is somewhere that no public institution is prepared to go. There is another thread I need to pull, because it converges with everything above from a completely independent direction. And the convergence itself is evidence that the underlying phenomenon is real. Energy return on energy invested. EROI, the ratio of the energy delivered by an energy source to the energy required to extract and deliver it. If you drill for oil and get 100 barrels of energy for every barrel you spend on drilling, your EROI is 100 to 1. If you mine coal and get 50 units of energy for every unit you spend extracting it, your EROI is 50 to 1. The concept was developed by Charles Hall, an ecologist at the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry, beginning in the 1970s. Hall had studied under Howard Odum, the systems ecologist who pioneered the treatment of ecosystems as energy circuits. Odum had shown that you could understand an entire ecosystem, its food webs, its nutrient cycles, its population dynamics, by tracking the flow of energy through it. Hall took this idea and applied it to something Odum had not attempted at scale: human economies. The insight was deceptively simple and profoundly uncomfortable. An economy is, at its most fundamental level, a system for converting energy into useful work and distributing the products of that work to its participants. Money is a claim on energy. GDP is a measure of energy conversion. When you strip away the financial abstractions, the debt instruments and derivatives and currency fluctuations, what remains is physics. How much energy goes in, how much useful work comes out, and what is the ratio? Hall realized that this ratio, the EROI, is the most important number in economics that no economist measures. It is the metabolic rate of a civilization. And just as Kleiber's law shows that an organism's metabolic rate determines its lifespan, the EROI of a civilization's energy sources determines the surplus available for everything that makes the civilization worth living in. Every hospital, every school, every highway, every research laboratory, every symphony orchestra, every fire department, every military base, every internet server farm exists because the energy surplus allows it to exist. Reduce the surplus, and these institutions do not get slightly less effective. They become thermodynamically unsupportable. And the surplus is declining. In the early 20th century, the EROI of petroleum in the United States was approximately 100 to 1. You sank a well in East Texas or Spindletop, and the oil practically leapt out of the ground. The surplus was staggering. 1 barrel of energy invested in drilling produced 100 barrels of energy output. That 99-barrel surplus powered the construction of the interstate highway system, the suburbanization of America, The Apollo program, the creation of a consumer economy that produced more material wealth than any civilization in human history. The entire American century, the period of unprecedented economic expansion from roughly 1945 to 2000, was built on an energy surplus so vast that it felt limitless. By the 1970s, as the easy, shallow reservoirs were depleted and extraction moved to deeper, harder geology, the EROI of domestic oil dropped to roughly 30 to 1. Still enormous, still enough surplus to fund the space shuttle, the internet, the personal computer revolution, and the globalization of the economy. But the trend was downward. By the 2000s, conventional oil's EROI was approximately 15 to 1. Deepwater offshore, roughly 10 to 1. Tar sands in Alberta, where oil must be strip-mined from sand and cooked in upgraders to produce synthetic crude, approximately 5 to 3 to 1. Shale oil produced by hydraulic fracturing, roughly 5 to 1 depending on the play in the year. And here is a number that almost nobody in the renewable energy debate mentions, even though it should be central to every conversation about the energy transition. Solar photovoltaic panels, according to estimates that vary by methodology, but cluster in a consistent range, have an EROI of roughly 10 to 25 to 1. Wind turbines, roughly 15 to 25 to 1. These are respectable numbers. They are above the civilizational minimum threshold, but they are not 100 to 1. They are not even 30 to 1. The transition from fossil fuels to renewables, which is absolutely necessary for a dozen other reasons, does not solve the EROI problem. It stabilizes it, perhaps, at a level that is dramatically lower than the level that built the world you currently live in. The infrastructure around you, the highways, the hospitals, the research universities, the telecommunications networks, the global supply chains, all of it was built during a period when the energy surplus was between 30 to 1 and 100 to 1. Maintaining that infrastructure at an energy surplus of 10 to 25 to 1 is a different proposition. Not impossible, but measurably more expensive in energy terms. The transition to renewables is not a transition to abundance. It is a transition to adequacy. And adequacy is a very different economic and political experience than abundance. A 2025 preprint published on Research Square, analyzing global data from 1995 to 2020, found that global EROI across all energy sources declined at a compound annual rate of 1.6%. The decline reflects the combination of falling fossil fuel EROI and the increasing share of lower EROI renewables in the global energy mix. The net effect is a steady erosion of the energy surplus available to the non-energy economy. 1.6% per year sounds modest, but compounding is deceptive. Over 25 years, that means the global energy surplus available for non-energy activities shrank by roughly 33% between 1995 and 2020. The preprint states explicitly that if this trend continues, the energy sector will need to expand by approximately 24% by 2050 just to deliver the same amount of net energy as in 2020. Not to grow, not to expand, not to power new AI data centers, or electrify the global vehicle fleet, or build the infrastructure required to adapt to climate change. Just to stand still, just to deliver the same net energy that the global economy received in 2020. And there is a threshold below which civilizations cannot sustain their current level of complexity. Hall and his colleagues published a paper in 2014 in the journal Energy Policy, arguing that a modern industrial civilization requires an EROI of at least 10 to 14 to 1. Below that range, the energy surplus available for non-energy activities begins to collapse. Not gradually. The relationship between EROI and available surplus is nonlinear. At an EROI of 10, roughly 90% of the energy is available as surplus. At 5, it drops to 80%. At 3, only 67%. At 2, 50%. At 1, 0. The curve steepens sharply as EROI approaches the lower range, which is why Hall calls it the net energy cliff. You do not gently slide into energy poverty, you fall off an edge. And we are standing near that edge right now. Global EROI, as of the most recent comprehensive estimates, hovers around 12 to 15 to 1, depending on methodology and boundary definitions. We are not below the threshold yet, but we are on it, and the trend is downward at 1.6% per year. And a separate 2025 analysis published on ArcSiv projects that the extended EROI of oil, specifically, will fall below 1 to 1 by approximately 2081. Below 1 means it takes more energy to extract the oil than the oil contains. The resource does not run out. It becomes thermodynamically pointless. You are spending more energy to get it than you will ever get back. The convergence of the EROI data with Betancourt's scaling framework is the thing I cannot look away from. The Betancourt equation says the innovation cadence must accelerate to prevent collapse. The EROI data says the energy surplus available to fuel innovation is declining. Two independent constraints, one mathematical, one thermodynamic, both governed by measurable parameters, converging on the same moment. The moment when the system requires faster innovation than the available energy can support. Joseph Tainter, an anthropologist at Utah State University, published the definitive analysis of this dynamic in 1988. His book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, examines the fall of the Roman Empire, the Mayan civilization, and the Chacoan society of the American Southwest. And his thesis is one of those ideas that, once you hear it, restructures the way you see every institution around you. Tainter's argument is not that civilizations collapse because of external shocks. Not invasion, not plague, not earthquake, not drought. His argument is that civilizations collapse because of a property intrinsic to complexity itself. Each new layer of institutional, technological, or bureaucratic complexity that a society adds costs more to implement and maintain than the previous layer, while delivering less marginal benefit. The first road you build connects your two largest cities, and the economic return is enormous. The 100th road connects two minor towns, and the return is modest. The 1000th road connects two hamlets where almost no traffic flows, and the return is negligible. But the maintenance cost of the 1000th road is the same as the maintenance cost of the first. The benefits decline. The costs do not. This applies to everything. The first layer of taxation funds an army that protects the entire society. The fifth layer of taxation funds a bureaucracy that manages the fourth layer of taxation. The first public health measure, clean water, saves millions of lives. The 20th public health regulation generates paperwork that employs compliance officers. Each layer is individually rational. Each layer solves a real problem. But the cumulative weight of all the layers eventually exceeds the surplus that the society generates. And here is the insight that connects Tainter to everything else in this story. There is a crossover point. The point where the cost of maintaining the current level of complexity exceeds the benefit the complexity provides. At that point, collapse is not a catastrophe imposed from outside. It is, from the perspective of the people living through it, a rational economic decision. Simplification becomes cheaper than maintenance. Tainter documented this in exhaustive detail for the Roman Empire. Between roughly the 2nd and the 5th centuries, the Roman state faced a steady escalation of frontier threats, which it addressed by expanding the army, which required higher taxation, which required a larger bureaucracy to collect the taxes, which required additional administrative layers to manage the bureaucracy, which required further taxation to fund the administrators. Each response to a problem generated new costs that required new responses. The marginal return on each increment of complexity declined, and eventually, provincial populations began to calculate, sometimes explicitly, that the benefits of Roman citizenship, the roads, the aqueducts, the legal system, the military protection, no longer justified the costs, the taxation, the conscription, the regulatory burden. When the Germanic tribes arrived, many Roman provincials did not resist. Some welcomed the newcomers. Collapse was not defeat. It was opt-out. The Maya followed a similar trajectory. Between roughly 600 and 900 AD, the classic Maya civilization in the lowlands of present-day Guatemala and southern Mexico built increasingly elaborate ceremonial centers, expanded their agricultural systems through labor-intensive terracing and canal networks, and developed a political hierarchy of escalating complexity. Each edition consumed labor and resources. The returns diminished. When a sustained drought hit in the 9th century, the system had no surplus to absorb the shock. The civilization did not adapt. It simplified rapidly. The great cities of Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque were abandoned within roughly a century. The population did not vanish. It dispersed into smaller, simpler communities that required less surplus to maintain. The pattern is the same in both cases, and it is the same pattern that Betancourt's equations describe. A complex system adds layers of organization. Each layer costs resources. The resource requirements compound, and eventually, the rate of resource demand exceeds the rate of resource production. In Tainter's language, the marginal returns on complexity decline until they cross zero. In Betancourt's language, the superlinear scaling of demand outpaces the system's ability to generate surplus. In Hall's language, the EROI drops below the threshold required to sustain the current level of complexity. 3 vocabularies, 1 phenomenon, Tainter's framework, Hall's EROI framework, and Betancourt's superlinear scaling framework are the same argument expressed in different units. Tainter measures declining returns in organizational complexity. Hall measures them in joules. West and Betancourt measure them in scaling exponents. But all 3 are measuring the same underlying phenomenon. A complex system distributes resources through a network. The efficiency of that distribution is governed by a parameter. And when the parameter crosses a threshold, the system does not gradually weaken. It does not slowly fade. It hits a boundary, and it simplifies rapidly. Whether you call it collapse or correction or simplification depends on your vocabulary. The mathematics does not care what you call it. And here is where the EROI data and the Betancourt data converge in a way that should genuinely alarm anyone who is paying attention. The Betancourt equation says that the innovation cadence must accelerate to prevent the next singularity. Innovation requires energy, not metaphorical energy. Research laboratories consume electricity. Manufacturing new technologies requires raw materials that must be extracted, refined, and assembled, all of which consume energy. Deploying innovations, building new infrastructure, retraining workforces, restructuring institutions, all of it costs energy. And the EROI data says the net energy surplus available to fund these activities is declining at 1.6% per year. 2 clocks, one counting down the time until the next required innovation, the other counting down the energy surplus available to produce it. Both governed by measurable parameters, both trending in the same direction, both ignored by every policy framework on the planet. And there is one more layer, the one that makes everything I have described so far look parochial. Because everything I have told you, organisms, companies, cities, civilizations, energy systems, all of it operates within the physical universe. And the physical universe has its own version of the same problem, its own single variable governing its own fate. And that variable, like beta, like EROI, like the 3/4 power law, may not be stable. In March of 2025, the most powerful instrument ever built for mapping the large-scale structure of the universe published results suggesting that the number which determines whether everything ends slowly or catastrophically fast is drifting. In 1998, 2 teams of astronomers made the most unsettling discovery in the history of cosmology, and I want to tell you about it in a way that captures what it actually felt like at the time, because the textbook version strips out the human experience and leaves only the result, and the human experience matters for understanding why the implications were buried. The Supernova Cosmology Project, led by Saul Perlmutter at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and the High-Z Supernova Search Team, led by Brian Schmidt at the Australian National University and Adam Rees at Johns Hopkins, were both measuring distances to a specific type of stellar explosion called a Type Ia supernova. These occur in binary star systems when a white dwarf star, an Earth-sized remnant of a dead sun, accumulates enough mass from a companion star to trigger a thermonuclear detonation. The physics of the explosion is well constrained, which means the peak brightness is predictable. You know how intrinsically bright the supernova was. You measure how bright it appears from Earth. The difference tells you how far away it is, the same way you could estimate the distance to a car at night by how dim its headlights appear. These supernovae are so luminous they can be detected across billions of light years, which makes them the best distance markers in the universe. Both teams were trying to answer what seemed like a settled question. The universe had been expanding since the Big Bang, roughly 13.8 billion years ago. Gravity was pulling everything toward everything else. The expansion should be slowing down, like a ball thrown upward, gradually losing speed. The only uncertainty was the rate of deceleration. Measure the braking rate, and you could predict whether the universe would eventually recollapse or simply coast to a stop. That was supposed to be the headline. The supernova data was supposed to measure how fast the brakes were working. What they found was that the brakes were not working. There were no brakes. The supernovae were dimmer than they should have been, significantly dimmer, which meant they were farther away than the decelerating model predicted, which meant the universe was not slowing down, it was speeding up. The expansion was not decelerating. It was accelerating. Something was pushing the universe apart, and the push was getting stronger over time. Adam Rees has spoken publicly about the months he spent convinced there was an error in his analysis. He checked for dust contamination, for calibration problems, for systematic biases in the sample selection. Saul Perlmutter's team went through the same agonizing process independently. Both teams arrived at the same result. The expansion of the universe is accelerating, and neither team wanted to be the first to publish it, because the implication was so strange that announcing it without airtight confidence would have been career suicide. The force driving this acceleration was given a name, dark energy, and it constitutes approximately 68% of the total energy content of the universe, more than all the visible matter all the stars, all the galaxies, all the dark matter, all the radiation combined. The majority of the universe's energy is something we cannot see, cannot touch, cannot detect directly with any instrument, and do not understand at any fundamental level. We know only what it does. It pushes, and the push is accelerating. Perlmutter, Schmidt, and Rees shared the 2011 Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery. They earned it. The result overturned the prevailing model of cosmology and introduced the largest unsolved problem in fundamental physics. What is 68% of the universe made of? Nobody knows. But the question that matters for this story is not what dark energy is. It is whether it is constant. Because the answer to that question determines whether the universe dies slowly or fast. And the answer depends on a single number. And here I need to tell you about one of the most embarrassing numbers in all of physics, because it connects directly to why the single variable governing the universe's fate is so poorly understood. Quantum field theory predicts that empty space, the vacuum, should have an energy density. The zero-point energy of all the quantum fields that pervade the universe should add up to a specific value. When you calculate that value, using the standard methods of quantum field theory, the answer you get is approximately 10 to the 120 times larger than the observed value of the cosmological constant. 120 orders of magnitude. That is not a small discrepancy. If the theoretically predicted energy of the vacuum were the correct value, the universe would have ripped itself apart in the first fraction of a second after the Big Bang. Nothing would exist. No galaxies, no stars, no planets, no atoms, no you. The fact that the observed cosmological constant is 120 orders of magnitude smaller than the theoretical prediction is called the cosmological constant problem, and it has been called the worst theoretical prediction in the history of physics. Nobody knows why the number is as small as it is. Nobody has a satisfactory mechanism for cancelling 120 orders of magnitude of vacuum energy. Some physicists appeal to the anthropic principle, the idea that we can only exist in a universe where the cosmological constant happens to be small enough for matter to form structures. Others argue this is not an explanation but a surrender. The point is this: the single number that governs the rate at which the universe expands, the number that determines whether everything ends in slow cooling or catastrophic disintegration, is one of the least understood quantities in all of physics. We cannot derive it from theory. We cannot explain why it has the value it does. And now, for the first time, we have data suggesting it may not even be constant. The simplest model of dark energy treats it as Einstein's cosmological constant, lambda. In this model, dark energy is a fixed property of spacetime. Every cubic meter of vacuum has the same energy density, unchanging across cosmic history. And the equation of state parameter W, the ratio of dark energy's pressure to its energy density, is exactly -1. If W equals -1 and stays there, the universe expands exponentially but at a constant rate. Galaxies drift apart. Stars burn out over trillions of years. The universe cools toward absolute zero. This is the heat death scenario. Slow, quiet, trillions of years to play with. That was the comfortable version. The Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument, DESI, is mounted on the 4-meter Mayol telescope at Kitt Peak National Observatory in Arizona. It uses 5,000 robotic fiber optic positioners, each one a small actuated arm that swivels independently to point at a specific galaxy or quasar, collecting light from 5,000 objects simultaneously. Over its first 2 years of operation, it mapped the 3-dimensional positions and recession velocities of millions of galaxies spanning 11 billion years of cosmic history. It is the most detailed spectroscopic survey of the universe ever conducted. In March of 2025, the DESI collaboration released their second data release, DR2, when they fit the baryon acoustic oscillation data to a model where W is allowed to evolve over time, using the standard CPL parameterization, where W of A equals WW.0 plus WA times 1 minus A. The result was a preference for evolving dark energy over the constant lambda model. Combined with Planck cosmic microwave background data and the Dark Energy Survey's 5-year supernova compilation, the statistical preference reached 4.2 sigma. When combined with the Pantheon Plus supernova compilation instead, it was 2.8 sigma. 4.2 sigma is not 5 sigma. In particle physics, 5 sigma is the threshold for discovery. Many 3 and 4 sigma results have evaporated. With more data, this is a hint, not a conclusion. The honest assessment is that the cosmological constant model remains viable. But the direction of the hint matters enormously, because the best fit values show W greater than -1 today, meaning dark energy is currently weakening. But in the past, at a redshift of approximately 0.5, corresponding to about 5 billion years ago, W appears to have crossed below -1. It entered what cosmologists call the phantom regime. And if W stays below -1, the consequences are not gradual. They are catastrophic. Robert Caldwell at Dartmouth College, along with Mark Kamiankowski and Nevin Weinberg, published the definitive analysis of this scenario in 2003 in Physical Review Letters, Volume 91. They called it the Big Rip. When dark energy density increases over time rather than remaining constant, the expansion of the universe does not just accelerate, it accelerates at an accelerating rate. And the scale factor of the universe diverges to infinity at a finite future time. In their canonical calculation, with 1.5, the timeline runs approximately 22 billion years from the paper's publication. But the final stages compress into a shockingly brief window. Galaxy clusters, the largest gravitationally bound structures in the universe, are torn apart roughly 1 billion years before the rip. The Milky Way, approximately 60 million years before. The Solar System, about 3 months before. The Earth, roughly 30 minutes before. And atoms themselves are destroyed in the final 10 to the -19 seconds, as the expansion rate of space exceeds the strength of the electromagnetic force holding electrons to nuclei. I want to pause on that timeline because the compression at the end mirrors in cosmological terms exactly the same pattern we have been tracking in civilizational terms. The majority of the time between now and the Big Rip would pass with no detectable effect. 13 billion years of normalcy. Then the destruction of galaxy clusters, a catastrophe of cosmic scale, compressed into the final billion years. Then the destruction of individual galaxies, compressed into 60 million years. Then the solar system, compressed into 3 months. Then the planet, in 30 minutes. Then atoms, in a fraction of a second. The pace of destruction accelerates on the same kind of superlinear curve that the pace of innovation accelerates on. The intervals compress. The series converges. The final stages arrive faster than the capacity to respond. The mathematical structure is the same. A single parameter governing the rate, a finite time singularity at the end. Even the universe, if DESI is right, is on a treadmill. I need to be precise about what DESI has and has not shown. The data does not confirm the Big Rip. The data suggests that W may have temporarily crossed the phantom divide in the past. whether it will do so in the future, whether the crossing was sustained or transient, whether the specific framework of phantom dark energy correctly describes the underlying physics, all of this remains uncertain. The honest framing is that the cosmological constant model still fits the data, but not as well as it used to. The Big Rip is a door that the data has pushed open slightly. It has not been walked through. But the structural point stands regardless of whether the Big Rip happens. The equation of state parameter, W, is the cosmological analog of beta. It is a single dimensionless number that governs the rate at which the universe expands. If W is exactly -1, the universe dies slowly over trillions of years. If W drifts below -1, the universe dies in finite time. The entire fate of every galaxy, every star, every atom, every subatomic particle in the observable universe is encoded in one number. And that number, like beta, is either incompletely measured, potentially unstable, and not monitored as a real-time vital sign by any institution on Earth. And here is what struck me most forcefully when I laid all of this research side by side and looked at it as a single picture rather than as a collection of separate findings. The mathematical form is the same at every scale. At the biological level, the 3/4 power law produces a finite metabolic budget that determines lifespan. At the urban level, the superlinear exponent produces a finite time singularity that requires accelerating innovation. At the corporate level, a constant hazard rate produces a half-life that no amount of institutional wisdom can extend. At the civilizational level, the convergent series of innovation cycles produces a hard wall that no amount of energy or cleverness can postpone. And at the cosmic level, the equation of state parameter determines whether the universe itself faces a finite time singularity. The form repeats a single parameter, an exponent or a rate or a ratio, a number that encodes the entire future of the system. And at every scale, the parameter is hidden. Not hidden in the sense of being inaccessible, hidden in the sense of being visible but unattended, published but unread, measured but unmonitored, available but unused. I do not think this is coincidence. I think it reflects something deep about how information flows through hierarchical systems, which is itself a scaling problem. The people who understand the mathematics are at the top of academic hierarchies that are disconnected from policy hierarchies. The people who make policy are embedded in institutional structures that are built to process economic data, not scaling exponents. The connection between the two requires a translation that nobody has an incentive to perform, because the translation converts academic curiosity into political impossibility. There is a deeper irony here as well. The Santa Fe Institute, where most of this work was done, was founded specifically to bridge disciplinary gaps. It was designed to be the place where the physicist meets the biologist and the economist and the anthropologist, and where the connections between their separate measurements become visible. And it worked. West and Brown and Enquist solved Kleiber's law because physics met biology at a Friday morning meeting. Betancourt and West discovered the scaling laws of cities because physics met urban economics. Wong and Bartlett connected scaling theory to the Fermi paradox because complexity science met astrobiology. But the bridge stops at the walls of the institute. The insights flow from biology to physics, to economics, to cosmology, within the Santa Fe Institute's small community of researchers. They do not flow outward to the institutions that govern energy policy, urban planning, monetary policy, or civilizational strategy. The bridge connects the disciplines, but not the disciplines to the world. And so the number sits in journals, published, cited, occasionally mentioned in popular science books that sell well enough to be translated into 15 languages and then placed on bookshelves where they are admired but not acted upon. West's own book, Scale, published in 2017 by Penguin Press, explained the entire framework with remarkable clarity. It was reviewed enthusiastically. It sold widely. It changed nothing. Not a single government agency created a beta monitoring program. Not a single central bank added superlinear scaling to its analytical toolkit. Not a single international body convened a panel to assess the implications of finite time singularities for long-term civilizational planning. The book was absorbed into the intellectual atmosphere, and then the atmosphere moved on. I want to come back to Geoffrey West now, because his story and the story of beta and the story of everything I have told you share the same architecture, and I think the architecture is the point. West spent the first half of his career studying quarks, the smallest structures, the fundamental building blocks. He spent that time in a world where every measurement was precise to many decimal places, where predictions were tested against experimental results with agonizing rigor, where the mathematics was expected to produce numbers that matched what the detectors recorded. And then the SSC was killed, and his father's death schedule caught up with him, and he walked into a different world, the world of biology, then cities, then civilizations, then the cosmos. And at every scale, he found the same thing: a single number, a scaling exponent, a variable that encodes the entire trajectory of the system, from birth to peak to decline to death. At every scale we can examine, decline is governed by a single parameter, a dimensionless number embedded in the topology of the network that distributes resources through the system. For organisms, the parameter is 3/4, and it sets your metabolic clock. For cities, it is approximately 1.15, and it sets the pace of the innovation treadmill. For companies, it manifests as a constant hazard rate that produces a half-life of a decade. For the energy economy, it is the EROI ratio, trending downward at 1.6% per year, measuring the shrinking surplus that funds everything civilization does that is not energy extraction. For the cosmos, it is WOW, the dark energy equation of state, which determines whether the universe dies in slow cooling or catastrophic disintegration. 5 scales, 5 measurements, 5 versions of the same insight. Decline is not random, it is not chaotic, it is not unpredictable. It is governed, and at every single scale, the governing parameter is either unmeasured by the relevant institutions, underfunded by the relevant governments, underreported by the relevant media, or actively excluded from the decision-making frameworks of the people who shape your future. The economist Kenneth Boulding said it best when he testified before the United States Congress. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. That line was sardonic, but the mathematics says something worse than what Boulding intended. Exponential growth is not even the problem. Superlinear growth, the kind that actually describes how cities and civilizations and networked economies function, is worse than exponential. It approaches infinity faster. It runs through its allotted time faster. And the tools we use to think about the future, GDP projections, corporate earnings forecasts, retirement fund models, government budget forecasts, all of them assume exponential growth at worst. None of them model superlinear scaling. None of them account for the finite time singularity. None of them track beta. I want to be very specific about what I mean when I say nobody monitors this, because the claim sounds like hyperbole, and it is not. The United States Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes GDP quarterly. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes employment data monthly. The Federal Reserve publishes inflation data, money supply data, interest rate data. The Census Bureau publishes population data decennially, with annual estimates in between. The International Monetary Fund publishes economic outlook reports for every country on Earth. The World Bank publishes development indicators across 200+ dimensions. The United Nations tracks sustainable development goals across 17 categories. All of these numbers are monitored, reported, debated, and used to make decisions. None of them publish the superlinear scaling exponent of socio-economic quantities as a function of population. The Santa Fe Institute, where West and Betancourt work, publishes academic papers. It hosts workshops. It produces books that are read by a small community of complexity scientists and reviewed favorably in the New York Times and then placed on shelves. But it does not publish a quarterly beta report. It does not issue alerts when the scaling exponent shifts. It does not maintain a dashboard that policymakers can check. There is no equivalent of the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the variable that governs the rate at which your civilization approaches mathematical impossibility. This is not because the measurement is technically difficult. Beta can be computed from census data and economic statistics that are already being collected. The inputs exist, the methodology exists, the equations exist. What does not exist is the institutional will to compute the number, publish the number, and confront what the number says. And I think the reason for that institutional failure is itself one of the most important parts of this story, because it is the same failure pattern that left Kleibers 3/4 unexplained for 65 years. The same pattern that left the implications of Bell's theorem unexplored for decades. The same pattern that allowed David Bohm to be exiled from mainstream physics for proposing an interpretation that turned out to be mathematically consistent. The pattern is not conspiracy. It is not malice. It is something more durable and more insidious than either. The mathematics of superlinear scaling implies that growth-based civilization has a finite lifespan. Saying that out loud in a cabinet meeting, at a central bank press conference, at a shareholder presentation, at a World Economic Forum panel, at a congressional hearing, is career suicide. Not because the math is wrong, because the implication is incompatible with the incentive structure of every institution that would need to act on it. Every government on Earth promises economic growth. Every corporate valuation model assumes revenue growth. Every pension fund is structured around projected market growth. Every mortgage is underwritten against the assumption of rising property values. Every national debt is serviceable only if GDP grows faster than interest payments. The entire institutional architecture of modern civilization is built on the assumption that growth continues forever, without limit. And the mathematics says that assumption contains its own negation. Growth based on superlinear scaling is self-terminating, not eventually, not probably. Mathematically, acknowledging this publicly would require restructuring every institution simultaneously. The financial system, the political system, the educational system, the corporate system, all of them would need to be rebuilt around a framework that does not assume perpetual growth. And no single institution can do this unilaterally. A government that abandoned growth as a policy goal, while its neighbors continued to pursue it, would be at a competitive disadvantage. A corporation that stopped growing while its competitors continued would be acquired or bankrupted. A retirement fund that stopped assuming market growth would be unable to meet its obligations. The mathematics produces a collective action problem of civilizational scale. Everyone knows, or could know, if they looked at the papers, that the trajectory is unsustainable, but nobody can afford to be the first to act on it. And so everyone continues, and the series continues to converge, and nobody monitors the variable. This is not a new dynamic. Tainter documented exactly the same pattern in Rome. The Roman elite understood by the 3rd and 4th centuries that the cost of empire was exceeding its benefits. Individual emperors attempted reforms. Diocletian restructured the entire administrative system. Constantine moved the capital. Julian tried to reverse the centralization of power. But no individual actor, not even an emperor with absolute authority, could restructure the entire system simultaneously. Each reform addressed one dimension, while the others continued to compound, and the system continued on its trajectory. Not because nobody saw the problem, because the institutional structure made the problem unsolvable from within. We are in the same position now. The papers are published. The data is available. The equations are derived. The pattern is visible across 5 scales of organization. And the institutions that would need to act on this information are constitutionally incapable of acting on it, because acting on it would require them to abandon the foundational assumption that justifies their existence. Geoffrey West is 85 years old. He was born in Taunton. He watched ships disappear over the horizon as a boy. He learned trigonometry and felt the power of a formula that turns a number into a prediction you can verify by looking out the window. He spent 3 decades studying quarks. He lost his career to a congressional budget vote. He was told by his own family history that he would be dead by 60. And instead of dying, he walked into the Santa Fe Institute and met James Brown on a Friday morning and started a collaboration that produced the most comprehensive mathematical framework for understanding why everything dies on schedule that has ever been written. He outlived his father by more than 2 decades. He outlived his grandfather by nearly 30 years. He beat the family pattern. He escaped the curve. But the curves he drew have not moved. The half-life of publicly traded companies is still approximately 10.5 years. The Compustat data has been updated and reanalyzed, and the constant hazard rate has held since 1950. The innovation cadence is still compressing. The time between major paradigm shifts in the 2020s is measured in single-digit years and shrinking. The architecture of large language models is being superseded on a timescale of months. Whatever replaces current AI will arrive faster than current AI arrived. Because beta is greater than 1. Because the series converges. Because the mathematics does not care what you believe about technology or progress or the human spirit. The EROI is still declining. 1.6% per year, compounding. The energy surplus that built the highways and the hospitals and the research universities and the data centers and the fiber optic networks is eroding beneath the surface of the global economy. You cannot see it because the infrastructure still works. The lights are still on. The supply chains still deliver. But the net energy required to maintain all of that infrastructure is consuming a larger share of the gross energy produced year after year, and the gap between what the system consumes and what the system produces is closing. Not because of any single crisis, because of the thermodynamic equivalent of compound interest working in reverse. And woe, the number that determines whether the universe dies in 10 trillion years of slow cooling or in a finite time singularity that rips atoms apart, is still under investigation. 900 scientists, 5,000 robotic fiber optic positioners, millions of galaxies mapped, the most detailed, 3-dimensional portrait of the large-scale structure of reality ever assembled, and the number they are converging on, slowly, with agonizing statistical precision, is drifting in the direction that nobody wanted to see. I want to be honest about something before I end this. Because I think honesty is what separates this kind of work from the 1,000 pop science videos that have already been made about scaling laws and dark energy and the Fermi paradox. I do not know what to do with this information. I have spent weeks reading these papers. I have verified the citations. I have tracked down the original data where I could find it. I have read the critics and taken their objections seriously. And I still do not know what you are supposed to do when you discover that the mathematical structure of your civilization contains a term that goes to infinity in finite time. The honest answer is probably nothing. Not because the situation is hopeless in some nihilistic sense, but because the mathematics describes a trajectory that individual actions cannot alter. Beta is a property of the network, not of any individual node. You cannot change the scaling exponent of human civilization by recycling more, or consuming less, or voting differently. The exponent emerges from the aggregate structure of social interaction. It is as much a property of reality as the speed of light, or the gravitational constant. You can measure it, you can study it, you can publish papers about it, but you cannot will it to be different. What you can do, and what West's work makes possible for the first time in human history, is see the trajectory clearly. You can know the shape of the curve you are on. You can understand that the acceleration you feel in your daily life, the sense that everything is moving faster, that the ground beneath institutions is shifting more rapidly, that the time between disruptions is compressing, is not an illusion. It is not stress. It is not anxiety. It is the lived experience of a superlinear scaling exponent doing exactly what the mathematics predicts it will do. And there is something in that clarity, even when the clarity is terrifying, that I think matters. West went looking for the formula that would tell him when he was going to die. He found it, and finding it did not kill him. It freed him. He stopped working on quarks and started working on the most consequential set of questions a scientist has ever addressed. He found the pattern that connects heartbeats to cities, to the Fermi paradox. He did that work not in spite of knowing the equation, but because of knowing it. I think there is a lesson there, though I am wary of extracting lessons from mathematics. The equation does not tell you how to live. It tells you the shape of the container you are living inside. And knowing the shape changes something. Not the shape itself, but your relationship to it. The men in Geoffrey West's family kept dying on schedule, generation after generation, governed by a pattern they could feel, but could not name, until one of them, the one who was supposed to die at 60, decided to write the equation down. He gave the pattern a name, beta. He gave it a number, 1.15. He placed it in the mathematical structure of the universe, alongside the speed of light and the gravitational constant and the charge of the electron. And the equation he wrote turned out to describe not just the men of Somerset, but every organism, every company, every city, every civilization, and possibly the fabric of space-time itself. He is 85 now. The equation says he should have been dead a quarter century ago, but the equation describes populations, not individuals. Individuals are noise. The curve is the signal, and the curve has not changed. The speed of decline is predictable. It is governed by a single variable. And the most technologically advanced civilization that has ever existed on this planet does not have a single instrument, a single institution, a single analyst, or a single line item in a single budget dedicated to monitoring the number that determines how much time it has left.